several years, we've seen a huge attack on voting rights in this country. Conservatives across this country have been doing all they can to change what's going on with our voting laws. A lawsuit was filed to try to get folks in these states, this is unbelievable, y'all, to only count registered voters. The current process, you count everyone, and you base your districts upon that. It is called one person, one vote. And the Supreme Court yesterday made an 8-0 decision. Conservative jurists combined with liberal jurists came to the same conclusion that we have one person, one vote in this country. And this is a critical decision because here we are heading into a presidential election year, and we have considerable attacks on voting in this country. And so I want to break it down right now. What does this actually mean to our process? This is a decision that came out of Texas. And so joining us on the panel, we have Barbara Arnwine, who, of course, longtime jurist, longtime lawyer, who's been very much involved in these various issues. We have, of course, Chris Metzler, who joined us as well, and Tiffany Lofton, a campaign strategist and former USSA president. And joining us on Skype, we have with the Sean Young, staff attorney with the ACLU Voting Rights Project. Sean, I want to go to you first and foremost because this is a huge ruling. Explain to our audience why it matters so much, and also it being an 8-0 decision.
Sure. Yesterday's Evenwell decision was a tremendous victory for equal protection and for the principle that every person should count in our democracy. And it was also a tremendous victory for minority communities whose political power would have been threatened considerably if the Supreme Court had gone the other way. And the case basically said that that a state should be allowed to count every person for redistricting purposes. Government services, government actions affect everyone who lives on our soil, not just U.S. citizens, immigrants, lawful permanent residents, and children. And each of these people are entitled to be counted in our democracy.
Barbara Arnwine, this is huge because, again, had the Supreme Court went another way, this would have totally thrown our election process into disarray.
Well, what's beautiful about this decision, first of all, how rare is it that the usual minority on the court is given the opportunity to write the majority decision? And the fact that the notorious RBG, no less than Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Justice, wrote this decision says everything. And it was very important because this issue of voting age population versus total population is very critical. Guess who's not in the, quote, voting age population? Usually people who are incarcerated. Guess who's not in it? Children. Guess who's not in it? Anybody who's an immigrant. Yet every person that I just noted, as Ruth Bader Ginsburg says so well in her decision, depends upon fair representation. They need representatives who are advocating for their interests, making sure there's good schools, making sure that they have, some kind of quality of life while in prison so that they can rejoin society, making sure that their interests are being represented constantly in the legislative chambers of the state Senate. And that's what was at stake here.
Here's what Justice Ginsburg wrote. Pull the graphic, please. She said, adopting voter-eligible apportionment as constitutional command would upset a well-functioning approach to districting that all 50 states and countless local jurisdictions have followed for decades, even centuries. Chris Metzler, for it to be an 8-0 decision for the conservative jurors to stand with the liberal justices, that says a whole lot.
Yeah, it absolutely does say a whole lot. And a couple of things here. One, this case was just absolutely made no sense to me from the standpoint of the plaintiffs. It's absolutely clear that it's total population. That's absolutely clear. So the fact that they even wasted the time bringing this was just absolutely ridiculous. And I think so, bringing both factions of the court, if you will, together says something extremely significant.
Okay, just so that you know, this case was brought by two plaintiffs in the state of Texas, my state currently, and they wouldn't have gotten 2 feet, but they were being supported, and I forget the guy's name, and I'm gonna have to do better research before I start doing these, but I wanted to get this one out quick. They got this thing pushed by a major GOP group and person through the various state courts and pushed up into the Supreme Court, because this whole situation has only been occurring as far as the 2 plaintiffs were concerned for basically approximately a year. And most problems that are addressed by the Supreme Court are basically years in the making. So for this to get pushed up there that fast, that just tells you that there was a lot of GOP support, because that's who would have benefited from this greatly. And I'm not going to say it was white privilege support, but in my mind that's where this is going. And that privilege is basically stemming from people who do not want to give up power and are searching for any way possible in order for them to maintain their political power.
We're going to talk about the Wisconsin voter ID law, but again, this lawsuit is another example of the kind of attacks we've seen to sort of chip away at voting rights in this country, trying to gain an edge, if you will, by conservatives, as we are seeing a voting electorate that frankly is moving away from folks who traditionally vote Republican.
This is absolutely true, and we saw that in this case. There were statistics that said 80% of Americans in this country are white folks who are over the age of 18. So if you do gerrymandering, if you do redistricting, what that does is section off the folks, like Barbara said, who traditionally have not been able to participate in the election, and it favors a certain party. And so now what you're doing is opening the gates so that all folks who are eligible and all folks who are counted in that district or in that area are able to participate and be represented. And so what's really important is, this was seen highly in Southern Texas and in Southern California, that there were a lot of folks who were unable to vote and aren't eligible voters. But what we need to make sure is that the Supreme Court is the victory. There are a lot of other steps and still things we need to take, like what's happening in Wisconsin. But also in the state of Arizona, we saw that there were folks who stood in line for over 5 hours just to cast their vote. So there are still, barriers for folks who are trying to participate in our electoral process, and we need to open that. We need to continue to do the work to open that up.
Sean, last question for you. Bottom line is, I think we're going, even though Supreme Court Rule 8-0, I believe we're going to still see
Yes.
more lawsuits.
Yes.
Where you're going to have conservative lawyers trying to figure out ways to thread the needle to frankly keep folks from voting, or to change voting patterns that could somehow benefit the GOP. They don't do well among African Americans, don't do well among Hispanics, are not doing well among young people. I think we're still going to see more of that. So this won't be the last Supreme Court decision.
Absolutely.
I think that's right, especially since the Supreme Court gutted and weakened such a significant portion of the Voting Rights Act. Throughout our nation's 150-year history since African Americans obtained the franchise, states have repeatedly gone out of their way to try to make it more difficult for people, especially African Americans, to vote.
All right, then. We certainly appreciate it. Thank you so very much, Sean. Thanks a lot. Folks, today voters head to the polls in Wisconsin for both the Democratic and Republican primaries. However, the number of voters that can participate in today's primary might be smaller as a result of Wisconsin's restrictive voter ID law. Although dozens of states have passed laws requiring voters to show some form of ID at the polls, Wisconsin folks are leading the pack in how tough it is. Some of the requirements include you must have a state government issued ID, a birth certificate is required to obtain a state ID. Student IDs are not accepted even if you go to a state college. Early voting was eliminated on nights and weekends. Now, there are some organizations working to get voters valid IDs and even helping with transformation. Joining us now on Skype from Milwaukee is Wisconsin State Coordinator for Vote Riders, Anita Johnson. Anita, you've been out there on the streets. What are you seeing in terms of people having problems when it comes to voting, and how significant will the drop-off be?
I've seen that people are very confused about the new photo ID law. They don't know what to bring to the polls. Vote riders have been able to go and do presentations at churches, food banks, neighborhood clubs, any place where we can get a podium to educate the public about the changes in the voting laws. Not only do we educate the public about the voting laws, we help these people go to the DMV to get a proper ID to vote with. And you are correct. When you go to the DMV to get an ID, you need a birth certificate, a social security card, and proof of residence.
First of all, not only that, when we talk about numbers, how steep do we expect the drop-off to be in Wisconsin?
There's a possibility. We have over 300,000 people that are registered voters. Those people can be affected at the polls today because they do not have proper ID.
I want to go to our panel here, Barbara, Chris, and Tiffany. And what's interesting to me is, again, every place that we've seen, and Scott Walker was totally busted when he gave an interview talking about voter fraud. They couldn't find one case. They couldn't find one. So the primary reason for having these new laws, voter fraud,
Yes.
is virtually non-existent.
Right.
And it's so vicious, because what we got to understand, what's happened in Wisconsin is you got the 300,000 people who don't have one of these forms of, quote, acceptable ID. And people are even so confused that those who have the right ID don't even know they have it.
Right.
It is so bad in Wisconsin that when they passed this law, guess what they did not pass? Any money. Any allocation of money to educate the voters about what this new law meant. What was the right ID? Why didn't they allocate the money? Because they wanted this confusion. They wanted people not to be able to exercise their right to vote. That is what we need to understand. Guess who's been caught up in this? Not only people who don't have birth certificates, but one of the people who has been on national TV talking about her controversy is a Holocaust survivor who was in a concentration camp, and she can't prove her ID to the satisfaction of this. So what is the purpose of these laws? What are they serving? How does keeping a Holocaust survivor from voting serve any kind of, quote, election fraud prevention problem?
Well, look, I've told my party in no uncertain terms, from the perspective of the Republicans, the demographics are changing. Rather than spending time on this nonsense, spend the effort to outreach in a sincere way to the different populations. That's how you win, because you're not going to win this.
Yes.
I mean,
You are outnumbered and you're being outgrown.
It's not going to happen.
It's
just not gonna
ridiculous.
happen.
I'm glad you said that.
Rather than take the time, why are you wasting all this time on this nonsense? It's like, let's do outreach, let's get those kinds of things. It's hard to rebuild a brand when in fact what you're doing is continuing to do more and more damage to the brand.
Right.
And the population is changing. There's nothing you can do about that.
Tiffany, keep in mind, when Colin Powell was in North Carolina and was invited there by Governor McCrory, Colin Powell called out the governor to his face about their voter ID law.
Yes, he did.
Right, which is what we need more of our leaders to go ahead and do. And so when we talk about, we talked about a little bit earlier, and you said a couple minutes ago, how we need to continue to expand this and how they're going to continue to be a tax. and now we're talking about an attack. And so I think that when we see this upcoming election for 2016 and all the folks who are participating and all the folks who have traditionally year after year gone out into the streets, gone out into the community to register our voters and to educate our voters like what's happening now, our students do that work too. And so the University of Wisconsin, the school system, they have a student organization called United Council that goes out and registers students all the time. If I can't bring my student ID to the polls, then what other form, what else proves that I actually go here and that I actually am able and eligible to vote?
All right, hold tight 1 second. Anita, we surely appreciate it. Thanks a lot. And
All right, so that's the segment on the attack against voting rights. In the case of the Supreme Court, the supporting of voting rights and representation of all individuals in this country. In the case of Wisconsin, Walker basically trying to knock a number of people eligible, not even eligible, but allowed to vote, being eligible, down in order to try to deliver the state of Wisconsin to the Republican Party.